Everybody. You're all very, very welcome to today's Doctoral College webinar. So what we'll do is just look at the contents of today's webinar. So as I said, it's all about organizing and analyzing the qualitative data in your PhD. So we're going to look at the whole area of an overview of qualitative research. So if I can just bring this up here. So just want to make sure that you can see this now. Okay, should be able to see the next slide. Sorry about this. It can't go to the next slide. 2 seconds. Sorry about this. Okay, so today's webinar should be able to see. Yes, okay. So we're going to look at the whole area of an overview of qualitative research, then looking at the issue of design and planning. And I'll go through this as quickly as I can today because I realize, that many of you will need to be elsewhere soon. Then preparing, just how you actually go through the steps of preparing to do your analysis, because it's a really, really important stage. Then looking at some of the data management tools that are in play and that are available to you. We're going to look then about how you organize qualitative data. And here, my colleague in Library and Information Services, Armin Straube, is an expert in this area, and I'm going to ask Armin to do a webinar all about, data management and data management planning. And then about analyzing. Really, really important area, just about analyzing qualitative data. And here we'd be looking at things like, say, analytical approaches. So say, for example, be looking at maybe thematic analysis and then just content analysis and narrative analysis, and looking at the differences between those and just how you can and when to use them, and what the advantages of them would be, and just how they vary in terms of technique. And then we're going to look at the whole issue of challenges, just by bringing up here, common challenges and solutions that you can find in undertaking, organizing and analyzing qualitative data. So some of those challenges would be things like, say, if you've data over just too much data, you've data overload. Another could be, say, for example, like research bias or your own inherent bias, things like consistency, reliability, and maintaining objectivity. And here we'll also look at things like reflexivity and just about, how, you can become, if you like, a more reflective researcher also. So there's a lot to cover, and also just sharing and reporting findings just to finish off. So there's a lot that we have to get through today. So I'm going to start because I just want to give you just an overview of qualitative research and what qualitative research is all about. So just about, just trying to understand what it is, its characteristics. We can say about it that it has certain characteristics, namely exploratory, because you're exploring, you're delving into a whole new area. It's also descriptive, very different then from quantitative analysis, and interpretive. So again, it would be seen as somewhat subjective as opposed to perhaps more objective kind of quantitative research. So we can almost say that, qualitative data is interpretive because you are interpreting the data that you have, first of all, organized and then analyzed. So that is a really, really important characteristic, and that could inherently be one of the criticisms of qualitative research, that because it's interpretive by its nature, that it can lead to certain skewing of the data, and that is where things like researcher bias can come in, and also areas of objectivity could also compromise the integrity and the validity and reliability and consistency of your data. So these are issues we can look at later, but for now I just wanted to take you through just an overview of qualitative research, and then we'll just look at the next slide about what it actually is. So we can say the methods that you would use typically for qualitative research, and you'll be very familiar with some of these, obviously, would be interviews, maybe focus groups, observations, and analysis of documents and documentation, primary sources of research. Okay, so when it comes to the main characteristics, so what would we say? What here it would be good to reflect on. Well, what does qualitative research actually focus on? What's it about? So it's about meaning. So it reflects on, if you like, or focuses on understanding of meaning, context, and complexity. So we often say that with qualitative data, that one of the advantages of it over quantitative data obviously can give us, a really great picture of, large sample sizes and large groups. Obviously, with qualitative data, it's going to be very difficult to replicate the kind of breadth of study. But what we can get instead with qualitative data is a great depth of study and richness in the data and more complexity. And qualitative data is wonderful to complement quantitative data as well. But obviously, if you're undertaking a quantitative study with 10,000, say 10,000 respondents to a survey, that's going to be exceptionally difficult to replicate, at a qualitative level, because, when you're trying to get into and delve down and go deeper into the complexity and the richness of the data, you're not really going to have the time and resources and finances and everything else to undertake a study of that extent. But with a relatively small sample of participants, you can find, a great deal of meaning, context, complexity, and which you don't necessarily get with quantitative data. Where quantitative data, where, as it says here, you're measuring frequencies or relationships, or maybe relationships between variables, between dependent and independent variables. So let's look at some of the characteristics. So I said earlier that it was exploratory, that it was descriptive and interpretive. So just to say about exploratory, first of all, we can say that we're discovering new concepts and patterns. So it's the meaning is there in the word itself. It's exploratory. You're exploring new areas of richness, new areas of data analysis, data collection, data interpretation. So, it's new concepts, new patterns, and that's where we get the complexity and richness of data that we refer to when talking about qualitative data. But it's also certainly descriptive, and we get we tend to get, lots of detailed accounts of particular phenomena. So, I know from my own PhD, certainly it was that I got, I did a large number of interviews with people who'd been involved in a particular type of diplomatic negotiation of a particular international agreement. And it was great to get the first-hand detailed accounts of what happened, and then try to corroborate those and triangulate those with, to corroborate the veracity of what had been said. But again, there was a lot of, interpretation. So I had to interpret that data. And, so you could argue, or somebody could have argued, that certainly when it comes to that I was, putting my own spin on this. This is what some people could argue. I never heard this particular interpretation. But certainly, when it comes to qualitative data, certainly we have to be careful of, our own biases, our own preconceptions, and to make sure that, when we are conducting, say, for example, semi-structured interviews or open, and dealing with, say, for example, dealing with open-ended questions, sometimes we can get answers that adhere to our own preconceptions, and maybe we are reluctant sometimes to challenge the answers that we receive. But it's important also, when conducting qualitative research, to be objective in what we do and to carry out, and that's what I found was very rewarding in my own PhD. I remember that a lot of what I'd heard from the participants, first-hand accounts from participants, somewhat was different to what I had expected. But that meant then when it came to interpretation that, that I was listening to people giving their own interpretation of what happened. So that meant that data I had then to understand their experiences, to give meaning to that. And it's and that, I suppose, is a particular skill in itself. But that's one of the characteristics of qualitative data, that it is interpretive. You're interpreting, the data. You are analyzing it in a way which maybe nobody else could analyze. And just to reiterate, you're exploring new concepts. You're looking at new patterns, new trends. You're looking at, just a description of what may have happened, or a description of particular events. So it's a really, really rich source of data, but there are things that you have to be careful about when you're looking at qualitative data, and just to reflect upon. And I think maybe in this webinar, we will discuss a bit the whole issue of reflexivity, and just about how, sometimes not taking fully at face value what it is that we hear when it comes to data collection, and when it comes to qualitative analysis. So just looking at some of the methods obviously involved, and again, just, remember, particularly from, previous webinars that we've done, just the difference between methods and methodology, because often they are confounded. So just here we're looking at methods, which of course is a very important part of methodology, but it's certainly not everything to do with the widespread or wide breadth of methodology, which is much, which takes in a much broader sweep than merely methods alone. So, but we'll just look at methods for now. So first of all, typical methods that we would use in qualitative data would be interviews. So these could be, individual interviews, group interviews. The second one, very common, is focus groups. Again, these could be like small cohorts of people with a common interest that come together, that are interviewed by you, or maybe others. Maybe you have people in the room helping you, and you get a good breadth, good number of participants who will give you, information that is, very rich in detail, typically, and will really help you in terms of, giving you the depth and of information that you require, for your particular study. So we did some focus groups here recently with PhD candidates, and it gave some really, really valuable information, but it also allowed us to get into good depth with the participants themselves. And we had, I think we had 5 or 6 different people going around from table to table, asking the groups, I think we had 6 groups, and we were asking the group, we each took turns to focus on a particular realm or particular topic, and then we asked the group those that set of questions. But it yielded a lot of very rich data, which we hope to put into practice, and which we hope to make, the PhD experience better here. Okay, so obviously, another one is observations. That can be, observations of participants and non-participants. The other is, analysis of documents. That can be like primary sources of data. Another very common methods when it comes to qualitative data is case studies, and we get, case studies for some time became a very, very popular form of qualitative, a really popular qualitative method when it came to undertaking research using or organizing and analyzing qualitative data. So let's look at some of the aspects of organizing and analyzing qualitative data in your PhD. So first of all, we can see, I just want to give some insights and some guidance on what it is we're doing here in this webinar today. So we'll give you, we'll try and help you to understand, the whole journey of undertaking qualitative research, then look at the whole issue from data collection to your findings, how you can build up a strong analytical framework, and then we'll look at why this matters for your PhD, because we can say the qualitative research, what it allows you to do is to look at your research questions in a great deal of breadth and depth, and it allows you to capture and to analyze a lot of, if you like, nuanced perspectives. Okay, so when it comes to research design and planning, so the first thing I want to talk about here is something called building a strong foundation. So think about what you need to do before you collect your data. So there's certain things that you will need to do. And, if you even think about, say, for example, even for a moment or two, if you were to reflect on, what is it before you can go and collect any data? What is it that you would need to do? Well, first of all, it's quite likely that you would need to, have ethical approval for what you are doing. And also just to have, a strong and thorough, if you like, research question, and also, have conducted the major part of a literature review, which would provide you with the gap in the literature that you were going to try and address. So all of those things would need to be done, before you go into the field and undertake your research. So before collecting data, there's a lot of planning that needs to go on beforehand. So just make sure, that you're planning, because that you plan, you have a good plan in place beforehand. As I said, just make sure, you have your research questions, because they're going to guide everything that you do. They're going to be your North Star when it comes to undertaking your research. But also just make sure you have ethical approval, because without ethical approval, you won't be able to, engage with any participants. But also that it also makes sure, that you have undertaken like a literature review or an extensive literature review, so that the gap that you were addressing. So all of these things need to be done beforehand. So a lot of planning is involved. A lot of groundwork is done, before you get to the stage of collecting your data. So the first thing that we'd look at here would be, say, and again, you're probably fed up with me, those of you who are regular attendees at these webinars, talking about the importance of your research question. But just make sure, that when it comes to collecting your data, that you have your research questions. They don't necessarily have to be your finalized research questions, because they can, writing research questions is an iterative process in which, your questions are changing. They can be refined, they can be honed, they can be reiterated, in different ways, and reinterpreted and rewritten. So, but just think of what your research question is before you go collecting data, because if you don't have a research question before you go collecting data, you don't know exactly what it is that you need. So having your research question ensures that you are better focused, and that everything you do is much more thorough than if you go into the field without a research question or research questions or strong research questions. Okay, so make sure, that your research questions are clear, that they're focused, they're open-ended. By that, I mean that they're not going to give you a simple yes or no answer, so these are ones that, rely on a lot of analysis, a lot of investigation, and a lot of academic rigor. And the research question, obviously, questions, they will guide your data collection process, because it's almost impossible to think of how you're going to collect your data unless you have a research question, because your research question will say, your research question basically states what it is you're doing in your in your thesis. So many of you I know will have applied, for Research Ireland funding, for the postgraduate scholarship scheme, and there in the application, it will ask you, about, they will often say in any seminars that we attend with Research Ireland, they will constantly say that the research question, could take longer than any other part of the thesis, but that for them, that is the singular most important element, of an application, because that's going to tell them, that there's a gap there in the literature, something that needs to be addressed, something that needs to be done. And the research question will, if you like, the effectiveness or the efficacy of the research question will then, lead to a much more effective doctoral thesis. So without a research question, but a good research question, it's going to be almost impossible to collect data, because you're not going to know what kind of data you need, what kind of methods you're going to use. So you really have to be very, very careful when it comes to, your research question. Okay. So another essential element when it comes to planning your, before you begin collecting your data, is you have, if you like, you have what we might call a sampling strategy. But all that means really is that you know who it is you are going to select as your target for your research, be it, people that you're going to question in terms of interviews, or say observe, or that you're going to work with and collaborate with on your research. So you have to think, first of all, who is it? So that's what I mean by purposeful sampling, is that, you target your selection. So, you could look at groups or individuals, or, for example, a particular community or members of a particular community, but you have to be careful, in who it is that you target within that community. And also, and obviously, an essential element, obviously, is having prior ethical approval, and prior informed consent is given by the participants for your study also. But it's just so important, before you go into the field, that you have, selected your participants, that you have spoken to them in advance, or you have sought to get their permission to undertake this study. And obviously then, after having the permission, then you can go and get ethical approval for your study. So you have to think of the characteristics of the participants, and how it is you're going to go about and recruit them. So for a particular study, you may decide, for example, if there's if you're dealing, for example, with the whole area of, say, for example, something like you're looking at the effect of social media on teenage children, then you would have to decide, okay, so that's your whole area of study. And obviously you would have a research question that's much more specific than that. But you would then have to decide, okay, who are my participants going to be? So then you have to decide, okay, are there going to be teenage children? How many of them? How many of those teenage children would be effective as a group that would give me the richness and complexity of data that I need to undertake this research and to, undertake a credible doctoral thesis? So you have to think about, what are the characteristics of the people that you are studying? If they're not going to give you any data, they're not really much good to you. But then again, you could say, well, actually, that in itself is interesting, because the fact that they have no particular bias or any conception of the effect of social media, or the potential harm that social media could have, that in itself you may find that to be interesting data as well. So think about your participants. Who is it that you're going to recruit for the study? That is a huge element. That could have a huge effect on the success or otherwise of your thesis. I remember that I had to, go through a lot of hoops to get the people that I needed for my research. But I remember that I targeted certain people, and I had to go, I had to travel, quite long distances to go and interview them. And but I was very happy with those that I did manage to recruit. And I thought that they gave, a lot of richness of data, a lot of complexity, and I got different interpretations of the same events, which again was very, very interesting. Two people in the same room had both had very, very different interpretations of what happened, during negotiation strategy. So again, that was all very, very useful and very interesting. I found that very enriching as well. And then obviously you have to think, well, okay, so you think of the participants, you think about how you're going to recruit those participants, and then obviously you have to consider, well, how many of these participants are we going to have in this particular study? So you have to think then of, a sample size that's appropriate to your design. So, if you're deciding to do, semi-structured interviews, you're not going to be able to conduct semi-structured interviews with 5,000 people. So you have to have, a sample size that's appropriate to the design of your project. Again, if you decide to go down the survey route and to undertake, quantitative analysis, for example, and use Likert scales and snowball sampling and other kinds of, techniques, you may then decide, okay, I'm going to interview, 5,000 people, but it's going to be through an anonymized survey. So you have to think of, what sample size are you going to have? Sorry, could I just ask you just to turn off your microphone? So, sorry, somebody has the microphone on there and it's just distracting. Sorry, thank you. So you have to think of, what's your sample size and is it appropriate to what it is that you're trying to do? As I say, if you're doing a case study, if you're doing, a number of interviews, you have to think, well, that's going to limit the number of the participants involved. So these are all decisions that you have to make, and decisions that are well worth discussing in advance with your supervisor and with your supervisory team. So the other thing that we have to consider, obviously, is ethics, and getting ethical approval, or what are the ethical considerations when it comes to your research. So obviously, before you undertake the research in the field, you have to get prior informed consent of the participants. So that means, that you need to have their consent and that they are informed of the whole process. So that, for example, if you are interviewing them, that you don't spring some, nasty surprise on them with regard to your line of questioning, or indeed, with regard to your to the interview techniques that you use. You must stay within certain parameters, if you like, and to the parameters that you have defined already when you've got their consent. So I would say you need their prior informed consent, because you need to be able to say to people, say if you conduct a series of interviews with a certain, members of a certain group, and then you decide, okay, that in your ethical approval application, you would say that the results would be anonymized. If you had told the participants in advance that the results would be anonymized, then afterwards, after your PhD, if you go away and write a book, but you identify who is in the study after, giving your after effectively having a contract with people, telling them that they would be, that their information would be anonymized. If you go away and publicize that information and identify those participants, then you've breached, a rather sacrosanct contract that you would have had with those people. So that is why, in prior informed consent, what it's meant to do is to ensure that those people who are taking part in the study know what you're going to do with the data. They know how long you're going to have it for. They know when it will be, if you like, what's the word? Not confiscated, but it's gone out of my head completely now. What, about for how long it's going to be in storage, and then for how long, and for after how long that data is going to be destroyed effectively, or is it going to be in the cloud? Is it going to be accessible to others? So that's why, it's really important that you set out, before you collect your data, what it is that you're going to do with that data afterwards. So, but to undertake that study, you need the consent of the participants, and you have to inform them in advance of, of the limitations of this, that, and to tell them, okay, it's going to be anonymized, and the data will be destroyed after, 3 or 4 years. Okay, there will be, and allied to that are certain confidentiality and anonymity protocols that you may not always, sometimes, I think in my PhD, I don't think I ever had to anonymize any of the data. Just trying to remember if I did. No, I don't think I ever had to anonymize any of it, which was actually, which I was very happy about, because, that anonymizing data can sometimes be, somewhat laborious, more laborious than you'd like to imagine. But obviously, if you have confidentiality and anonymity agreements in place with the participants, you must adhere to those. And as I said, just make sure that, you don't identify the participants if you have agreed already that, you're going to make sure that their data is anonymized. Okay, and then obviously, you need to have ethical approval, from your faculty also before you begin. And then also, you just need to make sure that everything is GDPR compliant. So this is an added layer of complexity sometimes when undertaking data collection. And but the one thing I would say is just, that a good tip for saving time is just to make sure that you have a well-designed study, because this will really save you time when it comes to the analysis stage. So that's just something that I would add when it comes to essential planning elements. Okay, so now we're going to look at getting your data ready. And as I said, my colleague here, Armin Strauba, in Library and Information Services, is, just an amazing expert on this area. And I'll make sure to get Armin in to look at the whole area of data management and data planning and getting your data ready. So what we're going to look at is just qualitative data and getting that data ready. So any kind of analysis, we could say, just starts before you begin the whole coding process. So the whole coding process, there are various kinds of coding, what kind of open coding, there's kind of axial coding, and something called selective coding. But before you even begin the analysis of your data, you must think about, your coding. And coding really can have a huge impact on the kind of richness of the data that you get. And I'll talk about that just in a little while, and why it might be good to do things like, say, creating a code book which documents each of the codes and its definition and its examples, from your data. But anyway, the next thing I would say is just proper preparation. If you want to get really meaningful analysis, you really, really need kind of proper preparation. So let's talk about steps when it comes to preparation. I've got 3 different steps here when it comes to preparing for the analysis of your data. So the first step, we could say, is the data collection stage. So here, what we would say is, that there's so many different ways of collecting data, but it's always good to have records of the data, like as I say, tangible records of the data itself. So it's always good, if you are undertaking any audio recording or video recording, that you adhere to the protocols involved. So as I say, if you're dealing with people who wish to be anonymized, they obviously may not wish to have their faces visible or their voice recognizable. So if you are, deciding to do a video recording or an audio recording, you must make sure, that you adhere to certain protocols that are in your ethical approval form. Also, and that are done with the consent and the prior informed consent of the participants. Also, things like, think about the interview notes that you're going to keep, the field notes, just what you're going to do in terms of document collection and organization. And think about also the backup procedures that you'll have in terms of collection. So, what would happen, say, if you lost data, for example, or what is it that you're going to, how are you going to back up your data to make sure that you don't lose it? So you have to think about, again, sometimes it's just a process of reflection here that you have to engage in, but it's just about making sure, that the whole thing is done thoroughly and that, your data collection is done to the very, very best of your capacity. The next thing is obviously transcription. Now, you are, and I hate to say, I hate saying things like, oh, back in my day, it was really tough, when we had to, but, and now I don't mean to say, oh, you're all very lucky because now you can, you can transcribe and, you can do an interview and it can be transcribed immediately, and you can use all kinds of AI tools to interpret that data or just to give you a summation of all that data. I remember when I did my transcription, I actually transcribed everything myself. And that was laborious for sure. And again, I'm not saying woe was me or that was awful, because it was a really, really effective way of remembering as I said, I had a lot of interviews, but it really helped me to transcribe the interviews themselves, because it brought me back to the picture, brought me back to where exactly I was when the interviews took place, brought me back to the room, the sights, the sounds, the smells, brought me back just to the thinking about the facial expression of those who were, engaging in the interview and in the discussion. And I just found it was really good in terms of putting my own interpretation onto the data itself. So, as I say, you have all this amazing technology and it can really, really help you, and it can make life better, obviously, and easier. But, I found using transcribing the data. I remember what I had was I had a little mini or micro recorder, and I had these little pedals, and I could just go back and forth, and I would just type out, what I heard. And as I said, and then I would annotate that somewhat and put in, various little notes along the way about, the person's demeanor changed at a certain point in time, or some other interpretation that I had of that particular interview. But it was all really good and really effective. And as I said, it gave a richness to the data. So as I said, you have great advantages now when it comes to transcription, and transcription can be, very laborious. And it's wonderful that now you have a lot of techniques and tools that can take a lot of that drudgery away. But you also need to be a little bit careful, I think, at times, say if you're using an AI tool, for example, maybe to harness and to gather and to collate a lot of the data, because, AI can engage in a lot of hallucination, which means sometimes it might go looking for things that are not there. So you just have to be careful, when using certain tools. But as I said, if I could have thought back when I was doing my PhD that I would have, a long interview and that I could feed that into something which could then give me, a summation of what was said, or perhaps distill the whole conversation down, or just give me notes from that, or rewrite the interview in a way, which was maybe more understandable or more logical in terms, or I could have asked it, if I thought, oh my God, I could ask this, I could have a transcript, and I could ask, for an AI tool to assess this interview thematically. That would have been, absolutely wonderful. But again, all I would say is just with any AI tool, obviously, and you're well aware of this, just to be aware of the limitations of certain AI tools. But when it comes to converting audio or video to text, as I said, you have a great deal of options now and a great deal of advantages as well. So just think of, um, just in, just in terms of checking your transcript. So no matter what tools you use, I would say it's always good to go back and to look at the transcripts and just see, say if you're using something to interpret the data for you, or to maybe, give you a summation of an interview that you have done, just to make sure that it is as you remember it and as you recorded it. Because as I say, these tools are amazing, but sometimes they are prone to certain errors, which you might not, which you might miss. Okay. Also, you just have to think of, what kind of time are you going to put into transcription? I know myself, when I did transcriptions of the data, it seemed to take forever. And, it was laborious, it was tedious, but it was also extremely rewarding as well. So you have to think of a kind of a, cost benefit analysis. Is the amount of time invested in transcription and in the, is it going to be worth it? I would say for me, it was definitely worth it, but many people don't have that amount of time, and and might hand over transcription to somebody else, and somebody else might transcribe the data for you, or else you might use certain tools to help you with your analysis. So again, just think about is it worth it to invest a lot of time in transcription, or is it much more effective to use interpretive tools to help you get rich sources of data from say semi-structured interviews or case studies or the data that you have collected. So again, that's all part of the preparation, and that's all worth thinking about. The other thing I would say, just with regard to preparation, is something called familiarization with the data, just to make sure that as I said, I always thought it was great to reread and to read the transcripts. So again, even if you're not going to be actually as I said, now that you've been spared the drudgery of having to write out all the to listen back to an interview and to write out the transcript. Now you have tools that can do that for you, and that is wonderful, as I say. But just be careful, that you don't get any false data, or that you don't get anything, which could put you into trouble with regard to, say, what you put into your thesis afterwards. Just make sure that what is in the transcript, if it's an AI generated transcript, for example, just make sure that it reflects the interview that you did. So that's why it's always worth going back. If you have a transcript, you have a transcript generated by AI, for example, but you listen to the recording, and just make sure that the transcript is exactly as it is in your recording, that the two are aligned together. And it's always good to take notes and make certain observations. And as I said, sometimes I would make observations afterwards about certain things or certain patterns that evolved in the interviews. And it was always good to listen back and think, okay, there's a long pause there, and then just trying to remember back the interview and think, okay, why was that pause there, or why did that person grimace when they said this particular thing? Okay, and then just to identify particular patterns. So I would say, that try, as I said, you have all this amazing technology, but it's always really good just to immerse yourself in the data, and just to make sure, because that makes sure that you don't miss any of the kind of insights that you might miss, say if you're using an AI tool, or if you have a transcript generated by AI. Sometimes you can miss certain things, but it's really important, I think, to immerse yourself into the data, to listen to the recordings, to go back and read the transcripts. It's always worth doing. Okay, just about a quick thing here about data management tools, and you'll always have different tools that you could use. And again, now it's wonderful that we have, different data management tools, and it makes the job of coding and transcribing and everything else so much easier. But it's just important to remember that no matter how good your software is, or no matter how good the tools are, that they don't replace your own analytical thinking. So your analytical thinking, I think I put that in capital letters here. Your analytical thinking is what creates meaning. So it's the spin, it's the interpretation that you put on the data that gives its meaning. It's not what anything else does. It's not what a software tool does. It's not what NVivo does. It's your analytical thinking is what creates the meaning. And being, an analytical thinker and critical analyst, is an essential prerequisite for a PhD candidate. So I'll just go through very, very quickly here some of the tools that are there. There's NVivo, which I think a lot of you will be very familiar with. There's something else called Atlas, Atlas.ti, and this is really good for something for building theory, or for interpretive analysis of data as well. And there's another one called Max QDA, which is fantastic for if you're doing both quantitative and qualitative data. And obviously, I'd say a lot of you will be familiar with NVivo, particularly those of you, those of you on the webinar here today. I'm sure you're on the webinar because you're using, qualitative data, but NVivo is really good in terms of large projects, in terms of really large data sets, and it's brilliant in terms of coding, which again, could be one of the trickiest parts of your data analysis phase. Okay, so think about what it is, say before you decide I'm going to use NVivo or I'm going to use, Max QDA or whatever. You have to think, okay, about your methodology. So the tool that you choose is going to be influenced by, your research methodology, the size and complexity of the data that you have, your budget, obviously. Say, for example, that you need a license to access NVivo, for example, or say, for example, that your institution might have, a certain number of licenses or may not have the licenses for certain software. So you have to think, well, is it going to be worth it, or is there a way that I could get a particular tool that I need, to analyze my data, to help me analyze my data, but it's not accessible, or you don't have the budget. So you have to think about that as well. And you also have to think about what training and support is available, because if you're using a particular form of, if say you're using a particular tool in terms of, your for data analysis, you have to think of, well, are you trained in the use of it? There's little point in buying something unless you know how it works. So just think about what supports are available, within your institution or within your peer group or within your department or faculty or school, that's going to help you in terms of, say, getting the maximum benefit from that particular tool. Okay, so then just to finish off, I think we'll finish off with this, just about organizing your qualitative data. So I would say, first of all, when it comes to, again, a lot of this is very self-evident. For example, I would say when it comes to the organization of your files, that it's so important about creating, a really good structure and making sure that your data is accessible, because you can have a lot of data, but you have to think about where you're going to store it, how are you going to manage it, how are you going to organize it. And, I think we came across this last week in the webinar project management, where, somebody had said that a PhD is not simply about intellect, it's also about organization. So you have to think about how you're going to organize your files. So it's good to have, if you like, a consistent naming convention for all files. And one of the things I learned during my PhD was to have a date. I always put the date on particular files. Even to this day, when I save something, if I save a Word document, I'll put the date on it. I just find that it always lets me know that this was the last version. You know, it's maybe you find that somewhat antediluvian or old-fashioned, but for me, that was really useful. And it's just always good to have a consistent, you know, a consistent way of working in terms of how you name certain files and certain folders, so that you're not dealing with files that are, you know, that have different kind of that are named in a different format to other files that you're using, and that can just create a lot of confusion, and files can just end up in all kinds of places. And just make sure, you know, that in your folders that you have, you know, that you have a good mechanism of organization that, you know, which reflects the data collection process that you have undertaken. And it's also good, and again, I didn't adhere to this myself when I was doing my PhD, and again, something I regretted, but just having a master spreadsheet which could track, you know, all the sources of your data, you know, what dates the interview took place, you know, what you know, who were the participants, all those kind of things. That would be really useful as well. But again, you know, it's up to you if you have the time and if you have the resources. But again, from those I have spoken to, you know, doing the PhD, some of them find, you know, having a spreadsheet like that very useful indeed. Okay, as I said, you know, my colleague Armin Strauba is brilliant on the whole area of data storage and data security. So just make sure that, you know, you have a backup on a secure institutional server, perhaps on OneDrive here or HEAnet or whatever. Just make sure that you have, you know, that your data is stored on a secure, you know, institutional server somewhere, and that you have perhaps, you know, a hard drive or an external drive, and that, you know, your data is stored safely, and just to make sure that it's not accessible to others, obviously. For more sensitive data, what's always good to do is to put a password or to password protect the data, particularly when you're dealing with you know, with sensitive data, and just making sure, you know, that everything is GDPR compliant, and also, you know, confidentiality protocols have, that you're adhering to those, and that you replace names, particularly when you're dealing with sensitive data, that you replace names with codes or with numbers or something else to make sure that the data is anonymized, so that if it's ever discovered inadvertently or lost, that somebody who has access to that data doesn't know the names of those who are participating in the study. Okay, so there's all kinds of different kinds of the coding process. Obviously, there's 3 different kinds of coding. So open coding, usually what you're dealing with here is creating, you know, codes and labels and looking at what the data is telling you. You have something also called axial coding, which is where you're looking. This is really good when you're trying to build up, if you're identifying connections and patterns between the data, or if you're trying to build up, if you like, conceptual relationships. And it's really good for, you know, in terms of, you know, helping you build a theoretical framework. And it's also good for relating different codes to each other. That's another form of coding. Again, sorry, we've very little time, so I have to go through this quickly. And then selective coding, where you're integrating codes into certain themes. You're developing, you know, particular categories or important categories of coding, and you're starting then to create a coherent narrative when it comes to your data. The last thing I'll say is just about categorization and themes. This is all about, you know, grouping your codes, you know, into particular categories, and then having themes, you know, and again, we probably don't have time to go into it, but just about, you know, the whole area of thematic analysis, where you where you are systematically identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns that you see occurring and reoccurring within your data. And here, all about categorization and themes. It's your linking themes back to your research questions. And again, always back to your research question, because that is where, that is the source of your study. That is effectively, what it is that you're trying to do. As I said, I'm sorry we don't have much time to go into, thematic analysis or or content analysis or narrative analysis, but I'll send you the slides later, and we can look at those. They're relatively self-explanatory, but I think you'll be able to get a lot more information from those when I send the slides on to you later. So I'll just say for now, thank you very, very much for your patience and for your time and for your tolerance. I know we tried to cover a lot there, and it was a lot of listening to one person. So I really appreciate the time that you've invested in this in this webinar. So for those who are watching on YouTube, I'll just say goodbye for now.